Okay, so in a previous video, I broached the idea of a magical decay cycle and magical decay, and proposed the idea of a magical decay cycle. You know, a decay cycle for magical energy. Different ways of wording things to make it make sense. At the time, I figured it's just an idea. Somebody else can take the time, effort, and energy and headache necessary to complete the tomfuckery and, finish it. Put numbers to it, etc. Like a timeline for, how many centuries the cycle would take to complete. Unfortunately, the idea stuck in my head, and it wouldn't go away until I dealt with it. This is that. Lucky me. The first thing we have to do is distinguish exactly what we're talking about here. In D&D in general, and 5e specifically, we're used to classifying magic in two ways. First off, broadly we think of magic as either arcane or divine, which is to say a means of manipulating magical energies through study and comprehension, arcane, or relying on one's faith and belief to manipulate magical energies, each divine, each trying to achieve a desired outcome. That isn't what we're discussing here. The second way we normally think about magic is via which school of magic a particular spell uses. Those being abjuration, conjuration, divination, enchantment, evocation, illusion, necromancy, and transmutation. These schools define how the spell is being cast. This also isn't what we're talking about here. And I gotta scroll this down again. Can't find my spare mouse, so you'll have to bear with me. I hate my laptop. That's okay. This is a terrible... I like having a mouse. Trying to mess around with this touchpad thing, I'm too old for this shit. Okay. Think I found it. Okay. The School of Magic defines how the spell is being cast. Whether it's arcane or divine often determines why the spell is being cast. And that's not what we're talking about. Okay. A decay cycle is about where the magical energy is being drawn from, or can or can't be used. Whether is determining at what point in a cycle of decay you can or can't draw magical energy from for a particular type of spell, or with a particular purpose. Depending on what kind of an outcome you want. We're not talking about the how or why for magic. It's the what. Different kinds of magical energy. In a lot of cases, that could relate to different damage types. It could relate to different character classes. Well, last time I talked about this, we, being I, decided that divine and necromantic energy should be at opposite ends of this cycle. Just before necrotic would be eldritch. We'll call that where warlocks generally draw from. Almost forgotten. Or forgotten but not dead. Just after necromancy is where we stuck dissipation and then nature. So we've got the beginning and end of the cycle and one in the middle. I initially had thought we could put the elemental magics between nature and the divine and sort through which element will go in which order. I would have put earth right after nature and lightning just before divine. And I'm going to scroll this down again. So at that point, it would have been eldritch, then necromantic, then complete dissipation, and that's the end of the cycle. Starting over, it would have gone nature, earth, water, air, fire, lightning. Then we get divine. How about this? Just before eldritch, put in infernal. And then it's just figuring out if and what would go between divine and infernal. And remember, we're not talking about the spells or the casters in this. Just figuring out the energy source, and we've got a little bit of a spectrum missing. Now I tried looking at different kinds of damage. Different kinds of damage that magic could cause. To find a little bit more perspective on our spectrum. Possibly reorganize things, make it a complete decay cycle. For 5e damage types, we've got acid, bludgeoning, cold, fire, force, lightning, necrotic, piercing, poison, psychic, radiant, slashing, and thunder. We can remove bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing, since they are strictly physical, and that leaves us with 10. Acid and poison are also strictly physical. They don't need magic to happen. So we're down to 8 to link up with our spectrum of 10 magical energy sources. Some of these will be obvious, like elemental magics, as well as divine, radiant, and necromantic. Others don't match up anywhere, but, if you notice, the elemental magics and damage types that correspond to them are also strictly physical. The effect doesn't depend on magic at all. The only ones that are almost always dependent on magic are radiant and psychic, and even those are debatable. I hope nobody was taking notes through this part, because this is when I realized I was entirely wrong, and I had everything in the wrong order. Now, this is where we start over. Starting from scratch, we know the end of the cycle is necrotic. Necromancy. Then the energy dissipates. Now, from the start, instead of nature, then the elements. Let's reverse that. All 4 individual elements, as basic forms of magical energy, can start. They can form naturally and rise. From this, they can combine into other forms until they mass into nature magic. If all the elements are combined, you get nature. That compounds over time. It grows in power, or it grows in purity, until it becomes divine. Then it's radiant energy. Over a long enough period of time without maintenance, divine decays into infernal. Infernal will eventually decay into eldritch. then finally into necrotic, and eventually it dissipates. This way we can run parallel to the old creation stories from our fantasy worlds and lend some credence to the whole idea. The primordial elemental chaos coalesced into nature and life, eventually bringing about the divinity of the gods. Some of these gods became infernal demons and devils, until they were eventually forgotten, only remembered as eldritch beings. In the end, they fell to necrotic decay and were gone forever. The source of the energy matches the creation story. We're good. So that's the energy cycle, the energy decay cycle for magic. But what about the timeline? Initially, we were talking about permanent magic, like well, we talked about a tiny fortress. We talked about a teleportation circle meant to be permanent. So, for any magic to decay into its next state, I talked about 500 years of dormancy or 500 years of neglect. Something's not being taken care of and used regularly for 500 years, it decays into the next state. That state of magic, of energy, might not work particularly well for the original intended purpose of the object. As long as it's being regularly used, regularly maintained, everything's fine. It's not going to change states. It's not so much when the batteries die as it is when the milk has gone sour. It's like I tried to explain when discussing where gods come from and what they are. 500 years of being forgotten, neglected, or otherwise not being maintained by the faith and memory of their followers. It might be long enough for said god to decay into the next state of being on the list, possibly even 2 or 3 steps down the list. So a forgotten god might become a demon. Or a neglected god might become a demon. If they're completely forgotten long enough, they might become an eldritch horror. Or a necrotic being. Someone remembering them, reading their scriptures, finding their temple might pull them back a little bit. But going backward on the cycle is a lot more difficult than following its natural course. So for anything really big, gods or adjacent, or something intended as permanent like a teleportation circle, we have a decay rate of 500 years of dormancy per stage along that cycle. Think of it like radioactive decay. Like a radioactive element decays over hundreds or thousands of years into a different element, then into a different element, a different state along its decay cycle, until eventually there's nothing left. As far as magic or enchanted items, without individual personalities, smaller stuff, I like the idea of thinking about it like expiry dates. Like, maybe if that +2 sword is left to rot and rust and, be misused after 100 years, it might only be a +1 sword. But if you take care of it, it'll be fine. 100 years for smaller objects like that seems to be a nice round number. Again, a few hundred years, depending on the amount of energy used, the type of energy, the spell that was cast, how long before it becomes a cursed item with a negative instead of a plus? When does it become a -1 sword? But it still radiates as magical. That means it's a cursed item. You know, it could be determined by the spell level when it was created, or whether or not it was cast multiple times in an attempt to make it a permanent enchantment. And keep in mind, like I said, while it's being used, everything's fine. It's in a stable state. Only after decades or centuries of neglect or cumulative damage cumulative damage, it'll start to decay. And that'll determine whether something is blessed, enchanted, or cursed. You know, might depend on how long it's been collecting dust or how it's been misused or neglected. So remember to polish your magic sword, and don't use it as a pry bar. Okay? Hopefully some of that made sense. But that's the entire decay cycle as I've put it together. Use it, don't use it, change it however you like. Make it make sense with the magic in your game world. Just have fun. And as always, like, share, comment, and subscribe. And I'll talk to you next time.